Hello YouTube. Today I want to talk about the multiple realizability argument in the philosophy of mind. Now, the way that this is presented in every introductory class in philosophy of mind, and I mean this is how I presented it in my series on the subject, is that the multiple realizability argument is an argument against the identity theory, type identity theory, in favour of functionalism. And what I want to show in this video is that actually pretty much exactly the same argument can be used against functionalism. There is a functional multiple realizability problem. But before explaining that, let's review the standard multiple realizability argument against the type identity theory. Okay, so obviously you can check out my philosophy of mind series for more details on this, but type identity theory claims that every type of mental state is identical to a type of brain state. For example, pain is the firing of C fibers. Fear is the stimulation of the amygdala, eliciting the release of adrenaline and cortisol, and so on. I mean, obviously, fear and pain actually both involve much more than this, but these simplifications illustrate the point. We can reduce types of mental states to types of brain states. Whenever there is a fear or a pain, there are these brain processes going on. And vice versa, whenever you have the brain processes, you have the mental states. They're just identical. Now, probably the most popular objection to the identity theory is that it fails to account for the fact that mental states are multiply realizable, which is to say that there could be, in fact, there probably are, organisms with physiologies very different from our own, but which also undergo the same mental states that we do. For example, the human nervous system and the octopus nervous system are radically different, but it seems that octopodes have minds somewhat like ours. So like octopodes can experience fear and pain just like humans can. So suppose we were to discover exactly the brain states and processes that occur when humans experience pain. Label these brain states B. The identity theorist claims that pain is identical to B. But now we can argue octopodes experience pain, octopodes don't have B, therefore pain is not identical to B. Two things can't be identical if you can have one without the other. And obviously, examples like this can be proliferated. Perhaps there could be aliens with minds, or perhaps we could build machines with minds. These creatures wouldn't even have neurons, let alone identical brain states to us. The point is, many types of physical states can realize pain, so pain can't be identical to any type of physical state. This multiple realizability argument was, as I say, one of the main arguments for functionalism. According to functionalism, mental states are identified not with some underlying physical structure, but with a particular causal profile. So a mental state is defined by the kind of causal or functional role that it plays in the overall system of which it's a part. For instance, pain is a state that is caused by bodily damage, and that causes distress, and that causes, say, a belief about the location of the bodily damage, and that causes withdrawal from the harmful stimuli. So pain is a state that has a particular type of sensory input, particular relations with other mental states, and in conjunction with those other mental states, a particular type of behavioural output. What the human pain, the octopus pain, and the alien pain all have in common is that they share this causal profile or functional profile. Pain in the octopus is caused by bodily damage, it causes distress, and it causes withdrawal from the harmful stimuli. Any state that has this causal profile is a pain. And it doesn't matter whether it's a brain state or some other state of a different type of nervous system, or a state of silicon chips or whatever. A particular state of an entity is a pain in virtue of its having a particular function, a particular causal role in the overall system. Okay, so that's the sort of standard presentation of, I guess, the multiple realizability problem. And although the multiple realizability problem was one of the main arguments for functionalism, in fact, functionalism faces a multiple realizability problem of its own. So we can call this the functional multiple realizability problem. And this is pointed out, for instance, in David Lewis's article, Mad Pain and Martian Pain. Lewis suggests that there could be a madman for whom pain has totally deviant causes and effects. The causal role of pain in this madman is different from the causal role of pain in normal people. Rather than being caused by bodily injury, his pain is caused by, Lewis says, moderate exercise on an empty stomach. Rather than being distracting, his pain facilitates concentration on mathematics. And he has no desire whatsoever to alleviate his pain. So, if this is right, if there could be such a madman, then the argument against functionalism is simple. The functionalist identifies pain with a particular functional role or causal role, F. F is caused by bodily injury, causes distress, etc. But the madman experiences pain, the madman is not in state F, therefore pain is not identical to F. The original multiple realizability argument was a serious blow to the identity theory, but the functional multiple realizability argument doesn't really seem to have made much of a dent in functionalism. Now, of course, a functionalist might just reject Lewis's example. Lewis thinks it's just obvious that there could be a person who experiences pain, but for whom pain has totally deviant causes and effects. He doesn't really provide any argument for this, so we might wonder, is it really so obvious that there could be such a person? Could a state that causes no distress at all, that doesn't distract a person but actually helps them concentrate, could a state like that really be pain? But this kind of problem can be pressed with much more familiar examples. For sufferers of psychosomatic pain, intense pain results not from bodily damage, but rather from stress, anxiety, and other emotional factors. Masochists are often disposed not to avoid pain, but instead to actively seek it out. They find it sexually arousing. For different reasons, people with depression may seek out pain through self-harm. They don't avoid the pain. People who are paralysed and people who are on drugs may be unable to exhibit any of the behaviour usually associated with pain. For some people, pain may be a powerful motivator. Consider the bodybuilder who pushes himself to beat the pain, who sees the pain as a sign of success. Whereas for other people, pain might simply be depressing or scary, or it might otherwise interfere with their goals, like the hypochondriac who interprets even the slightest pain as a sign of serious illness. Functional multiple realizability proliferates when we look beyond humans because the characteristic behavioural effects of pain in humans, such as wincing, screaming, crying, searching for painkillers, those are not expressed in most other species. Most other species don't have those behaviours. These examples show that pain seemingly can't be defined in terms of its causes and effects. It can't be defined in terms of its functional role. And it should be easy to see how similar problems will arise for other mental states. This is the multiple realizability argument against functionalism. Every type of mental state can be realized by many types of functional states, or at least many types of mental states can be realized by many types of functional states. Okay, so let's briefly consider some possible replies. I'll continue using the example of pain, but it should be obvious how these replies could be used in the case of other mental states. So, first, the functionalist might respond that the functional multiple realizability argument is mistaken in that it assumes that the functionalist claims that pain necessarily has certain causes and effects. But in fact, pain is defined in terms of its typical causes and effects. And I should say that this is how Lewis, in his article Mad Pain and Martian Pain, this is how he treats functionalism in solving this problem. So the masochist's pain is pain because it is a state that typically causes avoidance and distress. So for most people in this state, the state will cause avoidance and distress. Psychosomatic pain is pain because it is a state that is typically caused by bodily damage. For most people in this state has been caused by bodily damage. Now, the basic difficulty with this response is that it leaves open the question of what grounds there are for assuming that the masochist, say, is in pain in the first place. So we can grant that, look, assuming we already know that the masochist is in pain, then yes, the functionalist can accommodate this by appealing to typical causes and typical effects. But why do we count it as pain in the first place on the functionalist view? And in fact, the same kind of question can now be asked for even standard cases of pains, because once we sort of retreat to defining pain in terms of typical causes and effects, the appeal to causal profile no longer provides a way to demarcate pains from non-pains, provided that most of the things we call pain exhibit the right causal profile. It seems that anything whatsoever could be a pain or could fail to be a pain. So the feeling I get when I eat chocolate cake, for example, could be pain. It's just pain with atypical causes and effects. That's totally compatible with an analysis of pain as being typically caused by bodily damage and typically causing avoidance and distress. Assuming that I eat chocolate cake relatively rarely and I feel normal pains relatively often, right? So similarly, the feeling I get when I accidentally hit my thumb with a hammer and I scream out loud, that feeling could be joy, just joy with atypical causes and effects. How do we distinguish between cases of genuinely causally deviant pains, pains that have atypical causes and effects, genuine pains that have atypical causes and effects, from cases of things that are just not pain? Also, another problem here is, typical given what reference population, right? I mean, so if we want to say what counts as a typical causal profile, we need to specify a reference population, because what's typical for one group of people may not be typical for others. If you take humans overall as the reference population, then yes, we can say that pain is the state that typically causes distress and typically causes withdrawal from the harmful stimuli. But if you take masochists as the reference population, then pain, at least mild pains, typically cause sexual arousal. And in fact, for functionalism, the reference population is supposed to be all cognitive systems. The original point of functionalism was that the same mental state can have many different physical realizers. So, a human, a robot, an octopus, and so on can all experience pains. But then the causal profile of pain, as we've noted, is different in humans and other species. So it's not really clear that the appeal to typical causes and effects solves the functional multiple realizability problem. Okay, a second possible response is that functional definitions of mental states are domain-specific or context-specific. Although we often talk about pain without qualification, we just talk about pain in general. In fact, all talk of pain is relative to some sort of specific domain, specific context. There's no such thing as pain, but only pain in X. So pain in the normal human is caused by bodily damage, causes distress, etc. Pain in the masochist is caused by bodily damage, causes sexual arousal, etc. There are many different functional definitions of pain, each appropriate to different contexts, different domains. The fact that pain has different causes and effects for different people doesn't show that pain can't be defined as a state that has a certain causal profile. It only shows that there are different kinds of pain. Now, the trouble here is that this response entails that when we talk about, so when we talk on the one hand about pain in normal humans and on the other hand about pain in masochists, we're using the word pain in different ways. But that just seems wrong. So yes, we can grant that normal pain and the masochist's pain do have some differences, but there's evidently something significant that normal pain and the masochist's pain have in common, and that's generally what we use the term pain to refer to. We're referring to what to what these things have in common. So one way to make this problem clear is to say, in virtue of what are pain in normal humans and pain in masochists both called pains? Why do we class them both as pains? Why call what the masochist is experiencing pain in the masochist rather than something else? Why not call it sadness in the masochist, or surprise in the masochist, or whatever? We need to know what unites these two things as both being pains, and this doesn't give us an answer here. Interestingly, notice that the identity theorist can use the same response when dealing with the standard multiple realizability argument. So we can save the identity theory by identifying pain in the human with one type of physical structure, so brain states of a certain kind, and then we identify pain in the robot with another type of physical structure, like silicon chip states of certain kinds. And this, of course, would be a token identity theory. So it's not that types of mental states are identical to types of physical structures, rather each individual mental state is identical to some particular physical state. but for each type of mental state there might be a heterogeneous class of physical states. And this solution is unsatisfying in itself because it doesn't tell us, in virtue of what, the human pain and the robot pain are both pains. It doesn't tell us what groups these heterogeneous physical states together. And indeed, functionalism, was supposed to provide the answer to this, right? The functionalist says, well, the human pain and the robot pain are both pains, despite the differences in the physical states, because they both share the same type of causal profile. But as we've seen, actually, there's also a multiple realizability problem, a functional multiple realizability problem that arises at this point. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point that actually, the identity theorists and identity theorists have tried to kind of make this same sort of move. Okay, a third response. Despite the causal differences that pains can exhibit, the idea is that there might be some more abstract causal properties that they share in virtue of which they're all pains. We can solve the functional multiple realizability problem by making the functional definition more abstract. So functional multiple realizability only arises if we're defining the functional profile of mental states too precisely. If we make the functional definition more abstract, the problem disappears. So to see what I sort of have in mind here, compare pain causes wincing and crying with pain causes expressions of distress. Now, the latter claim is more abstract in a sense. Expressions of distress include wincing and crying, but they also include much else besides. There are many animals that will express distress in different ways. And so it seems like if we're wanting to provide a functional definition of pain, if we're wanting to say what the functional profile of pain is, the latter is clearly more plausible, right? We wouldn't want to define pain as something that causes wincing and crying, because there are many pains that don't make us wince and cry, but pain causes expressions of distress maybe is more plausible. That would account for pains in other species and in humans who aren't capable of wincing and crying. Now, of course, pain causes expressions of distress. Actually, that still isn't abstract enough. The masochist and the person who's completely paralysed, for example, will not be able to express distress in any ways. But perhaps we can go even more abstract than this. Perhaps there's some functional definition still more abstract that could do the job. So the question is, in light of all the examples of pains with deviant causal profiles, what exactly will this more abstract definition of the causal profile look like? And the worry here is that no matter how abstract you try to go, no definition of the functional profile of pain will capture all of the many pains with deviant causal profiles. So we know that the functional definition can't include caused by bodily damage because that rules out psychosomatic pain. It can't include causes attempts to alleviate it or causes withdrawal because that rules out the masochist's pain. Plus, we can't appeal to any causes and effects that would be specific to humans. When we consider the variety of causes and effects that pain can have or can fail to have, it really is difficult to imagine any sort of functional definition that would capture the many different causes and effects of pain. In a way as well that would be specific enough to distinguish pain from other mental states, right? That's another thing. We don't just have to give a definition of pain. We also have to explain what distinguishes pain from all of the other mental states. So yeah, I mean that's I think a bit of a problem with this response. And again, I should note that this response is available to the identity theorist. So Lawrence Shapiro, in his article Multiple Realizations, points out that a human brain and a robot brain, or a robot CPU perhaps, well, they may be different in various respects, but they might share the same physical structure if that structure is more abstractly specified. So a process occurring in an octopus brain or a robot's silicon CPU, that could be classed as the same type of process as a process occurring in a human brain, provided there is sufficient structural and organizational similarity. Obviously, the challenge now is to explain exactly what this more abstract physical structure, is how that's supposed to be defined. But actually, scientists have already begun developing an answer here. Consider the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, which argues that many non-human animals have similar mental lives to our own. Much of the evidence for this claim, that animals have minds very much like our own, much of the evidence for this rests on neurobiological similarities. So I quote from their conclusion. They say, convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviours. So, not only do they have the same intentional behaviours as humans, but many of the brain states or neural states are the same in some sense the same. And in fact, octopodes are explicitly cited in the Declaration as sharing important neurobiological substrates with humans, despite the many differences in our nervous systems. So again, this sort of appeal to a more abstract characterization of the functional states. Well, I mean, the identity theorists can make the same kind of move. The identity theorists can say, actually, pain is identical to a particular physical state, but we just have to characterize it more abstractly. So we wouldn't want to say that pain is the firing of C fibers, say, but there is a way of characterizing it more abstractly that allows us to say that pain just is a type of neural state, maybe, or a type of physical state. Okay, final possibility for the functionalist. So the functionalist might just bite the bullet and insist that the masochist's pain or the psychosomatic pain are not really pains after all. Actually, we should just say that, pain just is something that is caused by bodily damage, that causes distress, etc. And if somebody's in a state that doesn't have that causal profile, then they're not actually experiencing pain. This view strikes me as kind of ridiculous on its own terms, but the functionalist should find it especially unattractive. As I mentioned earlier, one of the primary advantages that philosophers have claimed for functionalism is that it's supposed to allow us to attribute mental states to a whole host of different kinds of entities, not just humans, but also octopodes, robots, aliens. They all might experience pain. The functionalist who adopts this response to the functional multiple realizability problem is committed to a fairly extreme conservatism about the mental. It looks like only humans will experience pain, and only the right kinds of humans. And again, of course, this response is available to the identity theorist. The identity theorist can simply say that since octopodes and robots don't share the same brain states as us, they don't experience pain, even though that would be counterintuitive. So, I'm sure there are other possible responses as well, but that should maybe give you a bit of a that gives you perhaps a sense of the debate here. Functionalism faces a multiple realizability problem that's pretty much exactly analogous to the multiple realizability problem that many philosophers think refutes the type identity theory. And furthermore, many of the responses available to the functionalist exactly parallel the responses available to the identity theorist. As far as multiple realizability is concerned, it looks like both theories are on a par. So as you know, historically, type identity theory came first, and then philosophers raised the multiple realizability argument against it, and then functionalism was developed in response to this. So it's like, yes, mental states are token identical to brain states, but mental states are really individuated in terms of their functional role. They're not type identical to brain states. And I think today there's a sort of mild consensus, let's say, in favour of functionalism. I wonder if things would have turned out differently if functionalism had come first. Maybe if functionalism had been proposed first, philosophers would have raised the functional multiple realizability argument, and this would have converted everybody to the type identity theory. And I don't know. But yeah, I just think that maybe a bit more attention should be given to the functional multiple realizability problem. And that's all I wanted to talk about. So thanks for watching.